question I want to start with is just how strange and different from our point of view were the ancient Israelites? Now, that question of difference is one that we've become really acutely aware of in contemporary world. Globalization, patterns of immigration, travel have brought different cultures into closer contact. And so we recognize differences in cultural practices, differences in values, even as we recognize a common humanity, common experiences, and common values. We are, after all, beings of the same species with the same kinds of bodies, the same kind of senses. So these questions about same and different are also key questions that arise when we attempt to study cultures from the ancient world, including the ancient Israelites. That sense of history and the recognition that the past is a foreign country really came into its own in the Enlightenment, at the same time that we find the rise of historical criticism of the Bible, the attempt to understand the biblical world on its own terms that were developed at this time. But even as scholars have recognized the different customs and worldviews and beliefs, they often tended to assume that the fundamental experience of what it meant to be a person in Israel or now was the same as ours. I mean, surely that's a universal. Now, more recently, though, we've come to realize that what it means to be a self, and even what it feels like to be a self, is also significantly a culturally shaped experience, subject to change over time. Now, perhaps the most well-known historical study of this topic is Charles Taylor's Sources of the Self. Taylor argued that the modern Western self is really a very distinctive product of changes that he attempted to trace back over time. Now, Taylor traced back the development of the Western self to ancient Greece, but others have wondered whether the ancient Israelite experience of the self was also quite different from our own. Now, notice that Taylor's study was about the modern Western self. And in fact, I think it would be even more apt to say the culturally modern European self, because the various modern and ancient East and South Asian cultural traditions, First Nation cultural traditions, African cultural traditions, and so forth will also produce self-experiences that have distinctive features. Now, Robert DeVito has studied the ancient Israelite self, and he argues, he says, I think it was really different from the modern Western self. And so drawing on Taylor, DeVito says, think about 4 major characteristics of the modern Western self. 1, there's that sense that human dignity lies in self-sufficiency, self-containment. 2nd, the modern Western self has very sharply defined personal boundaries. 3rd, the self has the capacity for autonomous action. And 4th, it's characterized by a sense of inner depths or inwardness, often explored by means of the experience of inner conflict. Now, even if what DeVito gives us is a bit of a caricature, I think we can recognize that type because it's oftentimes the character that's portrayed in films and novels, especially for male characters. Now, DeVito goes on to argue, he says, now I think that the ancient Israelite self would represent a really strong contrast. He says the ancient Israelite self was deeply embedded in social identity, that is, defined by its social role. Second, he says, was somewhat decentered and undefined with respect to personal boundaries. I mean, there's not a special word for the body as a whole in ancient Hebrew, as opposed to its parts. And even the word that comes closest to what we might call self, nephesh, is actually a word for a particular body part, the esophagus and trachea and the air that goes through it. Third, instead of exalting autonomy, autonomy is often criticized. Instead, what's cultivated as desirable is heteronomy, that is, obedience to and dependence upon another. And finally, he says, the Israelite self was altogether lacking in a sense of inner depths and doesn't reflect inner conflict. Another way of describing this contrast would be to say Israelite society was strongly sociocentric, whereas modern Western society is more egocentric. And those two types of societies will tend to produce persons and selves that are distinctly fitted for those cultures, but quite different. Now, I can't make up my mind, but I think that to a certain extent, DeVito exaggerates the differences in both directions. But the basic contrast is likely correct. But what I'm particularly interested, however, is in that bit about whether the ancient Israelite self lacked a sense of inner depths characterized by inner conflict. See, that just seems so counterintuitive to me. But is that simply because that sense of self-reflective interiority is so important to my culture's understanding of what it means to be a self? Now, my friend David Lambert has argued similarly to DeVito in his sometimes disturbing book, How Repentance Became Biblical. He says, no, that culture of interiority in which we pay attention to our emotions and retrospectively examine our lives and feel emotionally sorrowful for having done wrong and resolve to do better in the future. He says that's completely alien to biblical culture, and that scholars have been wrong in translating words like shuv as repent. What he just says is described in the biblical text are more like social transactions, without all the emotional and introspective baggage that we attach to repentance. I recommend David Lambert's book to you, but it can be a tough read. It's a little scary in places. As with DeVito, I think that Lambert overstates his case somewhat, but I also think in many respects he's right. But there's a distinction I want to make that neither DeVito nor Lambert does, and that has to do with distinguishing what people feel, think, or experience on kind of an everyday, unreflective basis from what aspects of that experience culture chooses to focus on and make us self-conscious about. That is to say, all people experience inner conflict. It's basically our default state. Now, people are also emotional animals. We do feel sorry about things. We do go over in our minds things that have happened. And if you read different works now in neuroscience of the self, you can easily reassure yourself that all of these things really are characteristics of people qua people, whatever culture. But not every culture tells you to pay particular attention to and cultivate these dispositions and practices. Our different cultures pick out, for various reasons, certain aspects of human experience and cultivate them. It gives them names. It symbolizes them, makes them feature in stories, creates speech forms that will highlight them, and so forth. These are the things that change over time, the cultural cues. So, am I saying, really the basic elements of the self are universal and it's just the cultural shaping that changes? Not quite. Because our cultural practices, including the symbols we use, the stories we tell, etc., these practices will reinforce certain synaptic patterns in our brains and so make just these connections stronger in our minds. So culture does, in certain respect, shape and reshape the brain, and so makes us literally different people. So if cultural practice gives us words for various aspects of emotional and interior experience, if it gives us forms of speech that name and model acts of introspection, or puts before us characters who express and enact inner conflict, or soul-searching and repentance, then we begin to pay attention to the corresponding features of our own experience and value them and cultivate them. And in that sense, we do have a different self-experience. We become different selves than we would be if we were equipped with different cultural resources. And that's the question I want to explore. Now, it does seem to be the case that much of the literary material that we have that arguably comes from the pre-exilic period shows very little interest in what we might call reflective interiority. Now, I don't want to over-exaggerate because there's ample evidence for a basic sense of interiority all the way through. Thoughts, for example, are described as inner speech. David spoke in his heart. And Proverbs warns against the hypocrite, literally the person who's capable of hiding himself, who intends one thing, says another. There are references in the Psalms to God searching the heart, the kidneys, hidden aspects. And similarly, as in all cultures, ancient Israelites had a basic distinction between the self as knower or agent, the one who says I, and the self as object of knowledge or action, the me or the me equivalent. Now, this splitting of the self into the I and the me is really common in all cultures. We do it all the time. I hardly know myself anymore, or I had to drag myself out of bed this morning, as though I and me were two different people. Now, similarly, the ancient Israelites could say, "Why are you so downcast, O my soul?" speaking to the self. So in a basic sense, as we would expect, there is an awareness of interiority and a place for it in the culture's understanding of the self. But it's also undeniable that in the post-exilic period, you see a growing interest in interiority, in emotional states, in mental activity, and in paying attention to the sense of being internally conflicted. So we begin to see the development of attention to and cultivation of an interiority that we recognize as fundamental to our own religious cultures. Now, yesterday, I described the development of an acute sin consciousness in Psalms that develop in the Second Temple period. In the vast majority of the earlier lament and thanksgiving Psalms of the individual in the book of Psalms, sin is not frequently mentioned. The problems for which the psalmist asks for relief are overwhelmingly the hostility of enemies or illness. Where sins are mentioned, there often appear to be more like a deduction that the psalmist has made. Given all this distress, I must have done something to make God angry. But these references are very short, and they're almost always followed by a return to focus on the enemies. Even in Psalm 38, which has one of the most prominent references to sin, note the way they visualize sin. For my iniquities have overwhelmed me. They are like a heavy burden, more than I can bear. Now notice that image of sin as a burden. That's something external, something borne on one's back. And relief would come from God's lifting it off. It has in no way affected the core of the person. This is not a sinful condition. Now remember the imagery from Psalm 51. The primary metaphor for sin is sin as stain. That is to say, it's something that clings to and affects the body itself. And unlike ordinary forms of impurity, the radical nature of this sin is indicated by the fact that it's congenital. Indeed, I was born with iniquity. My mother conceived me already with sin. Sin's not a matter of sinful deeds. It is the ultimate pre-existing condition, and no, your insurance will not cover it. Nor might we say that this sinful condition is only skin deep. Verse 12 prays for God to create in me a pure heart and make a new and steadfast spirit in my body. And heart and spirit are core terms for the self. Now consider, in the traditional lament, when the psalmist cried to God for help, it was against external foes. The entire subjectivity of the psalmist was located in that I that cries out. It's a unified subject. In this psalm, the psalmist cries to God for help against a foe that's internal. Indeed, a foe that is the psalmist's own heart and own spirit. So now we've got a split subject. The I cries out for help because of its sin-afflicted me. Now notice, too, where the attention is directed. When the foes are the enemies, attention is directed outward. When the problem is in one's own heart and spirit, the attention is directed inward. This is what I would call a structure of self-alienation, the I versus the me, that creates an interior landscape What distresses me and concerns me is within me. So in Psalm 51, we've got a novel cultural model for drawing attention to and cultivating a particular kind of experience, what I think can be called a kind of introspective consciousness. Now, several other Second Temple prayer texts develop similar techniques for self-examination, which are utterly unlike earlier prayers. I referred yesterday to the Barki Nafshi prayers. Even though these are thanksgiving prayers to God, what they thank God for is transforming each and every organ of the body and purifying it from its characteristic tendency to sinfulness. So that naming of the parts of the body and their problems can also be seen as a kind of self-examination that directs one's attention to the potential for sin located in each bodily organ. Now, does the culture of Second Temple Judaism also name phenomena relevant to the introspective self and inner conflict to make them more salient? Yes. Again, as I mentioned yesterday, the most significant new term is yetzer. The verbal root has to do with shaping or forming, and so the noun means inclination in the sense of how something is shaped so as to give it an ongoing tendency in some direction. But in later Second Temple texts, we begin to see this word objectified into an innate psychological characteristic. Now consider this passage from the Damascus document, one of the instruction texts from the Qumran community. So now, my children, listen to me, so that I may uncover your eyes to see and to understand the works of God, choosing what pleases God and hating what God rejects, living perfectly in all his ways, not turning away through the thoughts of a guilty yetzer and lecherous eyes. For many have gone astray by such thoughts. And then he proceeds to give a short history from the generations of the flood until now, demonstrating this tendency to sin because of the thoughts of a guilty yetzer and its effects. So the yetzer appears to be an innate desire to do what's wrong, because the synonym that he uses for it is another Hebrew word, ratzon, a word that can mean what pleases a person, so a desire. And it can also refer to an intention. So it describes something akin to both desire and will. I wonder if Augustine cribbed from the Damascus document. What is most significant is that it's not just wicked people who have a bad yetzer or ratzon. No, even Abraham had to struggle with this. So although many in antiquity, including Noah's sons, went astray because of it, the text says, Abraham observed the commandments of God, and he did not choose to follow the desire, the will, the ratzon of his own spirit. Now see what the author's done. We all have to make daily decisions. And the book of Proverbs is also offers to teach you how to make consistently good ones and avoid bad ones. But Proverbs always talks about specific desires, specific choices. The shift in the Damascus document is that it has objectified desire and inclination itself and given it a name. Now the problem is not the specific choice so much as it is that thing in you that gives rise to the bad desire and its outcome, the yetzer. Now, this is part of you, but it's a part of you that you have to reject, just as Abraham did. The culture has given a name to that alienated aspect of yourself. Now, this shift, objectifying bad desire or inclination and giving it a technical term, also contributes to the sense of a landscape of interiority to which one must pay attention. In contrast to Proverbs, where the attention is directed outward to the object of desire that needs to be assessed, when the yetzer is referred to, one's attention is directed inward to that dangerous and feared part of yourself that has to be controlled. Now, the most remarkable development of this kind of interiorizing of the moral life and the highlighting of the moral life as an inner conflict occurs in the two spirits teaching in the Dead Sea Scrolls. This teaching explains that when God created humankind, God placed in humans two spirits, the spirit of truth and the spirit of perversity. And they struggle against one another in the heart of a person. So these spirits could be thought of as psychological or characterological aspects of a person, but they also correspond to transcendent powers of good and evil, the Prince of Light and the Angel of Darkness. Now, the angel of darkness is going to try to corrupt you by engaging your own spirit of perversity. But the Prince of Light will aid you by strengthening your own spirit of truth. The teaching describes the behaviors and dispositions that are characteristic of truth and perversity so that you can study your own self. And these characteristics overlap significantly with the values that we find in Proverbs. But this teaching is so different from Proverbs. And consider how it has refocused the way a person experiences him or herself. Now remember, this is a teaching. It's not addressed just to your spirit of truth or your spirit of perversity. It's addressed to you, what we might call the executive self. But it's a teaching about how you can turn your attention on these internal aspects of yourself, and in particular to the way they generate conflicting moral impulses in yourself. So this is a highly developed landscape of interiority, and one that is entirely structured according to the perception of inner conflict. Now, one of the consequences of the terror of experiencing yourself this way is that it makes you desire the moral disciplines of the sectarian community of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And in fact, that community develops different disciplines and examinations, what Foucault calls technologies of the self, by means of which you can enhance your spirit of truth. Now, even if the particular moral self-experiences described at Qumran might seem a bit strange to us, you can easily recognize the type of moral culture that focuses on interior states and desires, and that uses a variety of means to cultivate the best aspects of the self. The religious disciplines of monastic spirituality and the practices of self-examination in Protestant pietism are both recognizable examples of a similar type of cultivation of the self and its interiority. Okay, so far, I've been tracing the development of an interest in interiority in Second Temple Judaism that specifically focused on anxiety about the moral life and especially the consequences of a sinful condition. But Second Temple Judaism was also interested in other aspects of psychology and mental states that don't necessarily have to do with sin. And I want to look at another one of the Psalms. Even classic Psalms of lament and thanksgiving from the First Temple times often depict emotions with a lot of vividness. I am sinking into the slimy deep and find no foothold. I am weary with calling. My throat is dry. My eyes fail while I wait for God. Lots of emotion. But what you don't find is the introspective turn in which the contents of one's mind or emotions are themselves examined in prayer. But consider the highly sophisticated retrospective review of previous thoughts and mental states that's depicted in Psalm 73, a psalm generally considered to be from the Second Temple period. Now, the psalm presents itself in verse 2 as a retrospective reflection by the psalmist on his own previous views. As for me, my feet had almost strayed. My steps were nearly led off course. Or as we might paraphrase, looking back, I was wrong. What he now judges to be wrong was the fact that he was envying the arrogant and the wicked. And so the speaker describes for 11 verses the mistaken views he once held. He even appears at one point to quote thoughts that he had at that time. Is it in vain that I have kept my heart pure, washed my hands in innocence? Now we know from verse 2 that the speaker no longer believes these things, but he brings his previous thoughts back into consciousness in an act of self-judgment. In verse 15, he even recalls the internal struggle he had at that time in the past concerning whether or not to voice complaints. Had I decided to say these things, I should have been false to the circle of your disciples. And so he recounts now his memory of a previous internal struggle that was based on his internal judgment of the effects that his words might have on others. And in the following verse, he even recollects his unsuccessful attempt to think his way out of the problem. So I applied myself to understand this, but it seemed a hopeless task. The breakthrough comes, he reports, as he went to God's sanctuary, and in that different physical context, he has different thoughts about the wicked. And moreover, as verses 21-22 indicate, it was this experience that also caused him to revise his own understanding of himself. In reviewing his previous state and its transformation, he judges that his own mind or heart had been embittered, literally soured, and his emotions, his kidneys, had been similarly impaired. They were pierced or stabbed. So what he now sees as his impairment, he characterizes as a false perception of reality. I was without knowledge. Now, these are all retrospective judgments on previous emotional and mental states and cognitions. Moreover, he has this final realization that even in his previous state of error and delusion, though he did not know it at the time, God was actually present with him, guiding him toward his present state, though now he is aware of it. This is a tour de force performance of introspection. And as a testimony, it's a public performance and a cultural model for others to imitate. Now, Psalms are exceptionally good models because they are a speech form that was apparently intended to be practiced by individuals as a template for organizing their own experience. But literary and artistic representation of exemplary figures is also a cultural mechanism by which experiences can be made visible and appropriable. The book of Job is probably unparalleled in its representation of complex psychological, emotional, and mental states. Now, I can only touch briefly on a few of these. First of all, the book constructs Job as a character of psychological depth. It makes what's going on inside him a major focus of our interest. Now, this is first done by juxtaposing the prose tale in chapters 1 and 2 to the beginning of the poetry in chapter 3. When Job last spoke in chapter 2, he spoke words of acceptance. Shall we receive good and not also receive evil? But now, after 7 days and 7 nights of silence, he breaks the silence with a violent curse on the day of his birth. He deeply wishes he had never been born. Now, this radically changed stance opens up a sense of Job's psychological depths, although his words only hint at the content of his alienation. Even the final verses of chapter 3 are enigmatic. For what I feared has overtaken me. What I dreaded has come upon me. But what is that? Precisely by not telling us what that is, the author has made the contents of Job's psyche the point of interest for us. Now, as Job begins to speak in the following chapters, he describes his sufferings vividly, but then so do a lot of the Psalms. But there are some distinctive things that suggest the author's interest in depicting particular states of mind in Job. One is the sense of how pain distorts what one desires and even the sense of time. In chapter 7, Job describes himself as like a slave yearning for the evening's shadows when he can rest, and yet When I lie down, I think, when can I rise? But the endless, restless night contrasts with my days that fly faster than a weaver's shuttle. So the interest in psychological states of mind is also reflected in several occasions in which Job refers to his distress at his inability to control his own psychological space. When he seeks refuge in sleep, he's terrified by dreams sent by God. The only escape from this intimate psychic torment would be death. And Job also engages in mental projection. He imagines hypothetically changing his mental state. If I say, I will forget my worry, I will abandon my sorrows and brighten up, but he anticipates that his knowledge of God's refusal to find him innocent would make this effort pointlessly exhausting. Now, this may not sound like a whole lot to you because our culture is so focused on analyzing and representing complex mental states. But what the author of Job is doing is incredibly innovative. The author does not have a culture of previous models to rely on. So he's exploring how to represent complex psychological projections, possible future mental states, without a tradition that tells him how to do this. So this is very sophisticated. But what seems to intrigue the author most is the problem of how to represent in a literary work the experience of what we might call cognitive dissonance. Now, cognitive dissonance is the mental discomfort or psychological stress experienced by a person who simultaneously holds two or more contradictory beliefs, ideas, or values. Now, a lot of interpreters have certainly recognized that Job seems to hold contradictory beliefs. Martin Buber summed it up quite well. Job believes in God in spite of believing in justice, and he believes in justice in spite of believing in God. So Buber frames the issue in theological terms. But here's my question. How's an author going to represent the psychological experience of a person who is caught by these two compelling but apparently contradictory beliefs? Now, for many years, when I've taught Job, my class and I puzzle over these repeated patterns in Job's speeches, in which at one point in the speech, he seems very hopeful about getting a fair hearing from God, but then somehow he loses confidence and ends his speech in utter despair as he contemplates his belief that God is implacably hostile. So I would often set my students the challenge. I would say, find me that spot, that verse where Job's thinking turns the corner. And there are at least 3 prominent examples of this pattern. So I don't think it's an accident. I think it's a design. Chapters 9 and 10 actually offer 2 psychological turns. In the first part of the chapter 9, Job is bitter about God's hostility, verses 14 to 33. But then he constructs a turn by envisioning a hypothetical situation. If God would only take his rod away from me and not let his terror frighten me, then I would speak out without fear of him. And in the following verses, at the beginning of chapter 10, Job begins to lay out what hypothetically he would say in such a case, and he seems to gain strength by imagining a God who would hear him. But even as he's describing God's care in creating him, the other compelling belief intrudes as he imagines maybe God was actually planning hostile scrutiny even while creating him. Yet these things you hid in your heart, I know you had this in mind, to watch me when I sinned and not clear me of my iniquity. And from that point, Job's emotional state declines until he ends the chapter yearning for death. Now, this same swerve is even more pronounced in chapters 13 and 14. First 2/3 of chapter 13, Job gradually works himself into the conviction that he could get a fair hearing from God. He says, "See, now I have prepared a case." The following line could be read as, "I know I am innocent." But the Tanakh actually translates it quite appropriately. I know I will win it. Once again, he asks that God meet him with restraint, and then summon me and I will respond, or I will speak and you reply to me. But as Job begins to envision what he would say to God, and he starts to list the ways in which it seems God has been hostile to him, that image of God overtakes the image of God as just, and he sinks again into deep despair in chapter 14, imagining God as eroding human hope as inevitably as water wears away even the strongest mountains. Same process plays out in chapter 23. Job envisions that if I could just come before God, I would set out my case before him, fill my mouth with arguments. There the upright would be cleared by him. But as he thinks about the hiddenness of God and the overwhelming power of God, he once again is in despair. Therefore, I'm terrified at his presence. When I consider, I dread him. God has made me faint-hearted. Shaddai has terrified me. Now, I'm not sure if modern psychologists would say this is how cognitive dissonance manifests itself in the human psyche. Nor could I say with certainty that the author of Job self-consciously said to himself one day, "Oh, I think I'll depict cognitive dissonance." But the author of Job is clearly intrigued by and attempts to give an artistic rendering of someone who is torn between two powerful but contradictory beliefs, and apparently without a tradition for how to represent this psychic drama. He hits on this technique of showing how one belief inserts itself into the consciousness and undermines the plausibility of the other belief. And in this way, we have a remarkable and I think utterly novel exploration of the landscape of interiority as it manifests itself in cognitive dissonance. So far, my two broad cases, first, the role of sin consciousness in the developing prayer tradition, and second, the representation of mental states in Psalm 73 and in Job, have both been about pretty serious matters. But exploring the landscapes of interiority can be done for fun and entertainment. In recent years, literary scholars have become intrigued by what cognitive studies calls theory of mind, or mind reading. Here again, this is something fundamental to all human beings. Many situations exist in which we really need to know the intentions and mental states of others. When a stranger approaches me, is that stranger friendly or hostile? Is my colleague concealing information from me? What does my friend think I assume about her feelings for her coworker? The human mind has evolved to make observations and form conjectures about the mental states and contents of others. The problem is we are only somewhat good at this, even though we can all persuade ourselves that we absolutely know what someone else is thinking or intending. Now, mistakes in mind reading are the basis for a lot of TV comedy. Just think about those plots. Mistakes in mind reading play a big role. Now, even though mind reading is a fundamental part of the human toolkit, it's one of those things that a lot of cultures just don't make the focus of attention. In fact, some literary scholars have made the case that it's only with the rise of the novel in modern European culture that there is a sustained attempt to represent people engaged in the practice of mind reading, and even to engage the reader in practicing mind reading of the characters in the novel. Now, sometimes, of course, the narrator is simply going to tell the reader what's in the mind of different characters. But in those sophisticated novels that practice limited point of view, we, the readers, are as actively engaged as the characters in mind reading. So while I think it is the case that the modern novel and related forms such as film are exceptionally good at presenting theory of mind issues, ancient Israel developed literary prose narrative to a degree that was uncharacteristic of most of the surrounding cultures. So my question was, do they represent theory of mind either by having characters practice mind reading or engaging the audience in that practice. Now, I'm still collecting evidence, but the focus turned out to be more rare than I expected. Now, that surprised me, given the frequency with which the plot device of deception is used in biblical narrative. And after all, deception is a deliberate attempt to trick someone else into false assessments, including an assessment of the deceiver's intention. But in most of the narratives that are about deception, I can't find that the author exploits the potential to make mind reading or faulty mind reading a real focus of attention. But there is one particularly clear example that does occur in the story of David and Saul. After Saul has repeatedly attempted to kill David, David discloses his fears to Jonathan. And Jonathan, dear naive Jonathan, still resists the notion that his father is intent on killing David. "You shall not die. My father does not do anything great or small without disclosing it to me. Why should my father conceal this matter from me? It cannot be." So Jonathan thinks he knows his father's intentions, but David disagrees. And so David explains his different mind reading of Saul's intentions this way. "Your father knows well that you are fond of me, and he has decided Jonathan must not learn this, or he will be grieved." So David thinks he knows what Saul thinks Jonathan feels about David. That's pretty good. Well, how are they going to find out? Well, they set up a deception that will make Saul reveal his intentions. David is expected to attend the king's new moon feast, but is not going to go. And when Saul asks where he is, Jonathan is to lie and say, "Well, David asked my permission to run down to his hometown, Bethlehem, because the whole family has its annual sacrifice there." Then if Saul says, "Okay," and goes back to eating, they know that David is safe. But if Saul is angry, they know that he is determined to do David harm. Now, as the events play out, Saul is furious and rages against Jonathan and even tries to kill Jonathan, his own son. At which point the narrator rather understatedly says, and Jonathan realized that his father was determined to do away with David. Okay, so here we've got at least one modest exploitation of theory of mind in this episode, but it's not all that intricate or sophisticated. Now, the narrative literature of the Second Temple period, however, we seem to see much more frequent attention to the theory of mind in clever and funny ways to exploit its potential. Esther, Ruth, and Jonah all make theory of mind figure critically in their stories. In Esther 6, the villain Haman has already plotted the destruction of the Jews. In fact, he's set up a stake in his yard on which he wants to impale Mordecai, his Jewish archenemy. And so he sets off to ask the king's permission to execute Mordecai. Meanwhile, back at the palace, King Ahasuerus has been up late at night reading in his book of records how Mordecai has saved the king from a plot against his life and realizes, I've never honored Mordecai. So when Haman arrives, the king speaks first and asks him, what should be done for the man whom the king decides to honor? And Haman says to himself, whom would the king desire to honor more than me? So we have a depiction of Haman thinking he can read the mind of the king and then suggesting all of the honors he would like to have, only to realize he's bitterly mistaken when the king charges him with performing all of these honors for Mordecai. Now, that's an exploitation of theory of mind for the purpose of humor. In this case, the audience is in the know, and it's Haman's mistaken mind reading that we enjoy. In the book of Ruth, it's the audience that has to do the mind reading. There's several exchanges between characters that are puzzling to the reader because we have difficulty in discerning the mental state of the characters. And how the reader fills these gaps has a lot to do with how we form judgments about the characters. What are we to make of Naomi's silence after Ruth's declaration of intent to go with her to Bethlehem? Why does Ruth misrepresent Boaz's words to her when she returns to Naomi after the first day's gleaning? He had said, stay close to my maidservants, and she tells Naomi, he told me, stay close to his men servants. Why'd she do that? And what game is she playing with Naomi? What is Naomi's intent and Ruth's when Naomi instructs her to dress up and sneak under Boaz's cloak after he's drunk himself to sleep? Now, these are not just gaps in the plot, but gaps in our developing a theory about the intentions and mental states of different characters. And in that strange and ambiguous exchange between Boaz and Ruth on the threshing floor, what does she mean by spread your robe over your handmaid, for you are a redeeming kinsman? Does she mean I'm cold, share the covers? Or I need your social protection? Or marry me? The Hebrew could mean any of these things. And what do we think he thinks she means? So see, now we're at second order theory of mind. The book of Ruth displays an extraordinary sophistication in using theory of mind to generate narrative interest and satisfaction. But it's Jonah that uses it to most dramatic effect. When Jonah flees from God's command to proclaim judgment from Nineveh, the reader easily supplies what seems like a plausible guess as to Jonah's mental state. The Ninevites are wicked, so this looks like a suicide mission. It's only at the beginning of chapter 4, after Jonah has carried out his phenomenally successful prophetic mission to the now repentant Ninevites, that we, the readers, discover we have completely misinterpreted Jonah's state of mind. He had not been fearful for his own safety. Rather, he knew that God was compassionate and gracious and would accept the Ninevites' repentance, but Jonah wanted them punished. So the mind-reading joke is on us. So once again, this is a very sophisticated literary use of theory of mind. That 3 short stories from the Second Temple literature each demonstrates different uses of theory of mind suggests that this interest in how people make surmises about other people's states of mind had indeed become a cultural focus of attention. And by practicing awareness of these skills and appreciating literature, the audience likely becomes more adept at these skills in everyday life. Or so at least some modern studies about reading literary fiction have suggested. So in this talk today, I've tried to make the case that the Second Temple period was a time when some significant changes developed in the cultural attention to what I have called landscapes of interiority. The increased concern for sin and anxiety about sinful condition was developed in forms of prayer and instruction that constructed and explored forms of self-alienation that drew attention to inner conflict in ways that created a sense of inner depths that Charles Taylor and Robert DeVito thought were lacking in an earlier Israelite culture. The author of Job focuses on different issues, examining in new ways the textures of mental distress in situations of acute suffering, and in particular develops novel ways of depicting the state of cognitive dissonance. And in the Hebrew short story of the Second Temple period, we see clever and playful uses of theory of mind. I think it's worth noting that these developments were happening contemporaneously to the developments in Greek philosophical thought that are usually identified as the first stages on the way to the development of the introspective self in Western culture. Now, there's no real indication of cultural influence between Greece and Israel on this particular point in either direction, since the types of development are really quite different. But these are parallel developments in a broader cultural landscape of antiquity in which increasing attention was being paid to the mind and the self. So I think the Greek philosophers need to slide over and make room on the bench for a variety of writers from Second Temple Judaism who were also making significant contributions to the sources of the self that we look for when we wonder about how our own understanding of the self came to be. Thank you.